"He's my son, but not my wife's," said the Marquis as he gave the baby to the young village woman. "Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from." Rain fell in sheets over the Tuscan hills, turning the vineyards into silver ghosts. The road to Montieri lay almost deserted, except for one carriage struggling against the storm. The horses snorted, hooves sinking into mud, until the driver pulled hard on the reins before a small stone cottage at the edge of the village. The door opened a crack. A young woman stepped out, holding a lantern that trembled in her hand. "Who goes there?" she called. Her voice wavered between caution and pity. The carriage door swung open. A tall man descended, his cloak soaked, his boots heavy with mud. He held something close to his chest, something small and crying. The lantern light caught his face for an instant. Pale, drawn, noble. "Forgive me," he said, his breath uneven. "You are Lucia Bellini?" Lucia hesitated. "Yes, my lord. But how do you know my name?" "I was told you are kind," he said, "and brave. I pray both are true tonight." She lowered the lantern, seeing then the bundle in his arms. The faint cry of a newborn pierced the rain. Her heart clenched. "A child. My lord, you cannot travel with an infant on such a night." He took a step closer, the storm swirling around them. "He's my son," he said quietly, as though confessing to the wind. Then, after a pause that seemed to still the rain itself, he added, "But not my wife's." Lucia's breath caught. She stared at him, at the anguish that carved deep shadows beneath his eyes. "You mean there is no time for questions," he interrupted. "They must not find him. You must keep him safe, please." She looked at the child's face, so small it barely seemed to belong to this world. "But my lord, I'm a poor woman. What you ask—" "Gold means nothing," he said. "What matters is silence. If anyone asks, he was left at your door. You understand?" Lightning tore through the sky, revealing the Marquis's crest on the carriage door. Lucia's knees trembled. "You are the Marquis di Montieri," she whispered. "Then this child—" He closed his eyes, his voice low and broken. "He bears my blood. That is all you need to know." Lucia took a step back, unsure whether to fear him or pity him. "And his mother?" The Marquis shook his head. "She is gone, taken by those who thought they were saving the family's honor." Something inside Lucia shifted, something tender and fierce. She reached out and he placed the child in her arms. The baby's tiny hand brushed her chin, and she felt warmth spread through her, stronger than fear. "You'll never speak of me," the Marquis said. "Not to the priest, not to your neighbors, not even to the boy when he's grown. Promise me." "I promise," Lucia whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if memorizing her face. "One day, he may come to know the truth. But let it be when his heart is ready, not when the world still judges sin more harshly than love." The thunder rolled again. The Marquis turned toward his carriage. "God keep you, Lucia Bellini." "Wait," she called. "At least tell me his name." He paused, his back to her. "His name is Marco." Then he stepped into the fog and was gone. Lucia stood there for a long moment, the rain washing down her face. The baby stirred in her arms, his cries softening into sighs. She carried him inside, lit a single candle and wrapped him in a wool blanket by the fire. "Marco," she whispered, testing the name as if it might vanish. "You poor little soul. What have they done to you?" He opened his eyes, dark, calm, watchful. A strange peace came over her. She could not explain it, but she felt as though the child had chosen her, not the other way around. She dried his tiny hands, murmuring lullabies her mother once sang. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving only the steady drip from the eaves. By dawn, the cottage smelled of milk and ashes. Lucia sat in the chair by the hearth, the baby sleeping against her shoulder. She had not slept at all. Her neighbor, old Signora Palma, knocked on the window. "Lucia, are you alive in there? The river nearly rose to your doorstep." Lucia hid the child beneath a quilt and opened the door just enough to show her face. "I'm fine, Signora." The roof held. "Strange night for visitors," the old woman said, peering past her shoulder. "I thought I saw a carriage go by." Lucia forced a smile. "Only lightning. It made the shadows move." The woman nodded, unconvinced, and left, muttering about omens. Lucia closed the door, her hands shaking. The promise to the Marquis already weighed on her like a chain. She turned back to Marco, who slept as if born to peace. "You'll be safe," she said. "I'll make sure of it." Hours passed. The storm clouds lifted, revealing the golden hills drenched in morning light. Lucia cleaned the cottage, warmed milk, and prepared to visit the church for Sunday Mass. She would have to face the village sooner or later. Before leaving, she wrapped Marco in a basket lined with cloth and covered him lightly. "No one must see you yet," she whispered. The path to the church wound through the vineyards, still glistening with dew. The bells were already ringing when she arrived. Villagers greeted her politely but distantly, as they always had since she lived alone. Father Tommaso smiled from the steps. "Lucia, it's good to see you. You missed the harvest blessing." "I was unwell, Father," she replied, lowering her eyes. He nodded kindly. "Come after Mass, then. I have something for you. A loaf from the convent, and perhaps we'll talk." During the service, Lucia's thoughts wandered. The Marquis's voice echoed in her mind. They must not find him. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, pale and desperate. What kind of life had driven a man of such rank to beg a village woman for mercy? When the congregation stood for prayer, she thought she heard a baby's cry, soft, familiar. But it was only her imagination. Still, she hurried home the moment Mass ended. The cottage was quiet when she arrived, too quiet. Her heart raced as she dropped the basket and rushed inside. The quilt had slipped aside, and Marco's eyes blinked up at her, calm as ever. Relief flooded her, and she sank to her knees, laughing and crying at once. "Don't frighten me like that, little one," she said. "You'll give me grey hair before my time." She spent the rest of the day caring for him, humming, pretending life could still be ordinary. Yet when night fell, the promise began to twist inside her. How long could she keep such a secret? She thought of the Marquis's wife, the Grand Countess Isabella, whose pride was known across the province. If the child was not hers, then whose could it be? And what would happen if she ever learned? Lucia pushed the thought away and fed Marco. His eyes followed her every move, curious and unafraid. "You're not meant for fear," she murmured. "You'll grow strong, won't you, and wise. Maybe you'll never need to know who your father was." The candle burned low. She laid him in the cradle she had used for her younger brother years ago, back when life was simpler. Sitting by the window, she watched the moon rise above the fields. Outside, a dog barked, then another, then silence. Lucia frowned. The hairs on her arms rose. She stood, listening. The sound came again. Hooves on the road. Not hurried this time, but deliberate, steady. A single rider. Her breath caught. The Marquis? Had he returned? She opened the door a little, the cold air brushing her face. The moonlight showed nothing but mist. The hoofbeats stopped near her gate. She waited, heart pounding, but no one came. Finally, she heard the rider turn back toward the main road. A folded sheet of paper fluttered down into the mud by the fence. She hesitated, then ran to pick it up. The wax seal glimmered faintly under the moon, the crest of Montieri. Her fingers trembled as she carried it inside. She wanted to open it, yet feared what it might say. Instead, she placed it beside the cradle and whispered, "Tomorrow. I'll read it tomorrow." Sleep would not come easily. Every creak of the cottage made her start. She dreamed of a castle filled with mirrors, each one showing a different version of herself. The seamstress, the sinner, the mother. When morning arrived, pale and cold, she unsealed the letter. The words were short, written in a hurried hand. "He lives, and for that you have my eternal gratitude. Keep him hidden. I will protect you from afar. No signature, no directions, only a small gold medallion tied with thread, engraved with a lion and crown." Lucia pressed it to her chest. "Marco," she whispered, "your father still watches over us." She didn't hear the footsteps outside, didn't see the shadow moving past the window. A knock thundered at the door, hard and sudden. She froze, clutching the baby to her heart. "Open in the name of the Marquis de Montieri," a voice commanded. "We're searching for a missing carriage. The Marquis was last seen on this road." Lucia's breath stopped. The letter slipped from her hand. The pounding came again, louder. "Open the door!" Her eyes darted to the cradle, to the medallion gleaming on the table. The soldier's boots echoed against the stones outside. Then, with one last crash, the door shook on its hinges. At dawn, Lucia heard pounding at her door. Soldiers from the Montieri estate had come, asking if anyone had seen the Marquis that night. Lucia stood frozen as the pounding continued. Her heart raced so fiercely that she feared the soldiers might hear it through the wood. Marco whimpered, sensing her fear. She pressed him against her chest and whispered, "Hush now, little one. Mama's here." Another voice barked from outside. "By order of the Countess Isabella di Montieri, open this door." Lucia gathered herself and opened it a crack. Rain dripped from the soldiers' cloaks as they peered inside. Their captain, a man with sharp eyes and a scar along his chin, stepped forward. "We seek the Marquis Lorenzo. His carriage was seen near the village last night. Did you notice anything unusual?" Lucia shook her head quickly. "Nothing, sir. Only the storm. No one travels that road when the river rises." The captain's gaze swept the room. The fire, the cradle, the damp floor. "You live alone?" "Yes, my parents are gone. I sew for the women of the village." He studied her for a moment, perhaps hearing the tremor in her voice. "We'll look around." Lucia moved aside, her fingers gripping the doorframe. The soldiers stepped in, muddy boots leaving dark prints on the floor. One of them lifted the quilt that hid the cradle. Marco slept soundly, his cheeks flushed. "A child?" the captain asked. "My brother's orphan," Lucia answered quickly. "He's been with me since autumn." The soldier looked doubtful, but lowered the quilt. "The Marquis's carriage broke an axle on the hill. The driver says his master went on alone. Strange behavior, wouldn't you say?" Lucia forced a small smile. "Strange things happen in storms, sir." The captain stared at her for another tense moment, then nodded. "If he comes this way, you'll send word to the castle. Do you understand?" "I do." He motioned to his men. They stepped out, their lanterns vanishing into the mist. When their footsteps finally faded, Lucia sank to her knees beside the cradle. Her hands shook as she stroked Marco's hair. "They'll come again," she murmured. "We must be careful now." By afternoon, the soldiers' visit had stirred the entire village. People whispered at the well, in the square outside the chapel. By sunset, every house had its own version of the tale. Some said the Marquis had been attacked by thieves, others that he had fled from his wife. When Lucia went to buy bread, the baker's wife stared too long at the bundle in her arms. "Such a fine blanket for a poor woman's child," the woman remarked. Lucia smiled tightly. "A gift from my cousin in Siena." The woman's eyes narrowed. A kind cousin indeed. Lucia left without another word, her cheeks burning. She had thought kindness would protect her from suspicion, but kindness was rarely safe when envy listened at the door. Days turned into weeks. The soldiers did not return, but the whispers did not stop. At the market, people turned their backs. The priest spoke gently but avoided questions. Children followed her path, chanting cruel rhymes about a woman and her secret baby. Lucia pretended not to hear. At night, when Marco cried, she held him close and whispered stories of saints and angels. "The world can be cruel," she told him softly, "but heaven still listens." As months passed, the boy grew stronger. His eyes were deep and curious, his small hands eager to touch everything. He laughed easily and slept peacefully, and Lucia began to feel a strange pride. "Look at you," she said one morning, lifting him high, "as if you were born for sunlight." But the village did not forget. When Lucia entered the church, old women leaned together in pews, muttering. "She had no husband," one whispered. "And that child, have you seen his face? He doesn't look like any Bellini." Lucia knelt, pretending not to hear, though the words struck like stones. Then, one evening, a traveling merchant came through Montieri, bringing news from the city. The villagers gathered around his wagon, hungry for gossip. Lucia stayed on the edge of the crowd, holding Marco by the hand. The merchant raised his voice. "Tragic tidings from the Montieri estate. The countess gave birth, but the infant did not survive. The bells of the castle tolled tonight for the heir they lost." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Then the Marquis's line ends." Another muttered, "Maybe it was God's punishment. They say he wronged his wife." Lucia turned pale. The Marquis's son, her Marco, was alive and his half-brother was dead. She clutched the boy's hand tighter and slipped away before anyone noticed her face. That night she sat by the fire, staring at the flames. "He'll be looking for you now," she said to the child, though he was too young to understand. Or perhaps she will. She prayed for strength, not for herself, but for the boy whose destiny was far beyond her cottage walls. The next morning brought another surprise. When Lucia opened the door, a letter lay on the step. No seal this time, only a folded scrap of paper. Inside were a few words written in a familiar hand. "He lives, and for that you have my eternal gratitude." She stared at the words until they blurred. The Marquis was alive. Somewhere, he still remembered the promise he had asked of her. As she tucked the letter away, the door creaked. Signora Palmer entered without knocking. "Lucia, you've been quiet these days. I thought perhaps you were ill." Her eyes wandered around the small room, resting on Marco, who was trying to stack wooden blocks. "What a handsome boy," the old woman said. "He grows fast." "Yes," Lucia replied softly. "Faster than I can keep up." Palmer leaned closer. "You know, there's talk in the square. Some say you took him from the foundling house. Others say he's the Marquis's." Lucia's heart jumped. "People will say anything when they're bored." The woman frowned. "Be careful. The Countess will not rest while her husband's affairs cast shadows over her name. If she hears rumors, she'll send men again. They say she pays well for truth." "I have no truth to sell," Lucia said firmly. Palmer sighed. "Just guard your tongue, my dear." She left, leaving behind a silence thicker than the storm had been. That night, Lucia took out the small gold medallion she had hidden. Its engraving caught the firelight. The Lion of Montieri. "You'll need this one day," she whispered to Marco. But not yet. Years slipped by like pages in a book. Marco learned to walk, then to speak, his voice bright and quick. He was clever, too clever for the village school. Lucia taught him letters with a slate and chalk she bought from a peddler. "Why do I have to learn so much, Mama?" he asked one day, grinning. "So you can speak with anyone, anywhere," she said. "No one will ever make you feel small." He laughed and threw his arms around her neck. "Then I'll make you proud." When Marco turned 6, a new schoolteacher arrived in Montieri. His name was Antonio Bardi, a young man from Florence who had lost his post after speaking too freely about reform and liberty. The villagers viewed him with curiosity, half respect, half suspicion. Lucia met him at the market, where he was buying fruit for his small classroom. He greeted her politely. "You're Signora Bellini, yes? The woman who sews fine linen?" "That's me," she said, balancing a basket of apples. He glanced at Marco, who was examining the coins in his hand. "Your son has a fine mind, I can tell. He counts before he can write." Lucia smiled, proud but cautious. "He's eager to learn. Bring him to my school," Antonio said. "No payment. I want bright pupils, not rich ones." Lucia hesitated. "The villagers might not like that. They already dislike me," he said lightly. "It will make no difference." She laughed, despite herself, and from that moment, trust began to grow. Marco took to his lessons quickly. He read faster than the other boys and asked questions that made even the teacher pause. Antonio often walked him home after class, chatting with Lucia along the way. Their conversations turned from lessons to books, from books to life. One afternoon, Antonio said quietly, "You've raised him alone. That takes strength." Lucia shrugged. "Strength or stubbornness? I'm not sure which." He smiled. "Either can build a good life." In the evenings, when Marco slept, Lucia thought of Antonio's kindness. It warmed her, though she dared not admit it even to herself. She had promised the Marquis silence, and love was a luxury silence could not afford. Yet peace never lasted long in Montieri. That autumn, a tax collector arrived from Florence. He was a stout man with shrewd eyes, sent to count every bushel and goat in the region. When he visited the school, he found Marco reciting Latin with near-perfect pronunciation. "You're a farmer's son?" he asked. "From the village," Marco replied proudly. The man frowned. "You don't speak like a peasant." Antonio stepped in. "Talent belongs to no class, sir." "Perhaps," the man said, eyeing the boy's face. "Still, he looks familiar." When Lucia heard of the remark, her heart nearly stopped. "Familiar," she repeated. What did he mean? Antonio shook his head. "Perhaps nothing. But the resemblance to someone of rank might stir trouble. Keep the boy close." Lucia nodded, though dread had already settled deep within her. That night she took the medallion from its hiding place and held it tightly. "No one must ever see this," she whispered. "Not until the world has changed." But the next day, During a lesson, Marco found the medallion where she had forgotten to hide it. He turned it in his small hands, admiring its brightness. "Is this yours, Maestro?" he asked Antonio. "It looks important." Antonio froze. The Lion of Montieri gleamed in the sunlight. During a tutoring session, Marco innocently showed Antonio the medallion, unaware that the Montieri crest gleamed in full view. Antonio stared at the medallion, his pulse quickening. He had seen that crest before, engraved on the iron gates of the Montieri estate, gleaming above the church altar where the noble family knelt each Christmas. The lion with a crown, symbol of old wealth and power. "Where did you get this, Marco?" he asked, his voice steady though his thoughts raced. "My mother keeps it in a box," the boy said proudly. "I found it when she was sewing. She said it's nothing, just a pretty coin, but I think it's from a castle." Antonio forced a smile. "Perhaps you're right. May I see it?" Marco handed it to him, unaware of the weight it carried. The gold was finely worked, the kind only a noble could afford. On the back, an inscription: "Virtus in silentio," strength in silence. "Marco," Antonio said gently, "you mustn't show this to anyone, do you understand? Not to the boys at school, not even to your friends." "Why?" "Because some things are meant to stay private. It's a treasure, and treasures bring envy." The boy nodded solemnly. "All right, Maestro, I'll hide it." When class ended, Antonio waited until Marco left, then locked the door and sat down, turning the medallion over in his palm. He felt a knot form in his chest. He had heard whispers for years about the Marquis and a mysterious child. Could it be true? He returned the medallion that evening, walking the narrow path to Lucia's cottage. She opened the door, surprised to see him so late. "Forgive me," he said. "I must speak with you." She let him in, sensing something grave in his tone. Marco slept nearby, his face peaceful in the glow of the hearth. Antonio placed the medallion on the table. "Where did this come from, Lucia?" Her face went pale. For a moment she couldn't speak. "He found it?" "Yes, he showed it to me." Lucia's hands trembled as she sat down. "It was foolish of me. I should have hidden it better." "Tell me the truth," Antonio said softly. "Whose crest is it?" She hesitated, searching his face. She had guarded the secret for years, but something in his eyes, honest, patient, unafraid, made her trust him. "It belongs to the Montieri family," she said finally. "The Marquis himself gave it to me." Antonio leaned forward. "Then the rumors are true." "I don't care what the rumors say," she whispered. "All I know is that he came to me one night, drenched and desperate, with a newborn in his arms. He said, 'He's my son, but not my wife's.' Then he left the child and vanished." Antonio's breath caught. "And you raised him?" "As my own." He looked toward the sleeping boy. "Then Marco is the Marquis's blood." Lucia covered her face. "Please, you must promise to say nothing. If anyone finds out, they'll take him from me. They'll destroy him to protect their pride." Antonio placed a hand on hers. "I'll keep your secret, Lucia. You have my word." She met his gaze, tears glistening in her eyes. "You think me a sinner, don't you?" He shook his head. "I think you're the bravest woman I've ever met." The words hung between them, tender and dangerous. She looked away, pretending to busy herself with the fire, but warmth rose to her cheeks. From that night, Antonio's visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought books for Marco, sometimes bread or candles, always an excuse to stay a little longer. The villagers began to whisper again, but Lucia no longer feared them as she once had. "Let them talk," Antonio said once, seeing her troubled expression. "Their tongues are their only wealth." But beneath his calm, Antonio knew danger was close. Rumors traveled quickly to the castle, where Countess Isabella ruled her husband's lands with an iron hand. Her spies carried every word of gossip to her, every whisper of scandal, every mention of the lost child. At dinner one evening, a servant dared to repeat the talk from Montieri village. "They say there's a boy there, madam. Clever, well-spoken, and rather like the Marquis." The Countess's knife paused above her plate. "What did you say?" "The villagers call him Marco. He lives with a seamstress named Lucia Bellini." Isabella's lips tightened. "Bellini, I know the name. She used to deliver linen to the castle." "Yes, madam. Years ago." The Countess rose abruptly. "Find out everything. Where she lives, who visits her, and what she hides. If this rumor is true, I'll have it ended before it spreads." The servant bowed and fled, eager to escape her fury. In the village, life continued quietly for a time. Antonio taught Marco arithmetic and poetry, while Lucia sewed in the sunlight and listened to their laughter. For the first time since that stormy night, peace felt possible. But peace rarely lasts where pride and power sleep. One afternoon, a carriage bearing the Montieri crest appeared at the church. The priest received a letter sealed in wax and pale blue ribbon. After reading it, his face drained of color. During Vespers, he approached Lucia after the service. "Child, I must warn you," he murmured. "The Countess has sent word. She seeks an illegitimate heir. She demands that any evidence of a child born of her husband's sin be delivered to her at once." Lucia's knees weakened. "She knows?" "Not yet," the priest said, glancing around. "But she suspects. Be cautious. These walls have ears." That night, Lucia could not sleep. The fire burned low as she packed a small bag of clothes and bread. Marco woke, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, where are we going?" "Nowhere yet," she whispered. "Just be ready." The next morning she found Antonio at the school. "They're coming," she said. "The Countess knows." He nodded grimly. "Then we must plan. There's a monastery near Siena. They take boys for study. I can write a letter to the abbot. Marco will be safe there." Lucia gripped his arm. "I can't let him go alone. You must," Antonio said softly. "If you stay, they'll find you both. But if he's hidden among scholars, no one will question him." Lucia turned away, her voice breaking. "He's all I have, Antonio." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have courage, and you have me." She looked at him then, really looked, and in his eyes she saw the steadiness she had lost in herself. "Help me," she whispered. The following night, they prepared for the journey. Lucia packed the letter from the Marquis and the medallion, wrapped carefully in linen. She kissed Marco's forehead as he slept. "One day you'll understand why I did this," she murmured. Before dawn, the carriage Antonio arranged waited by the road. The driver, a trusted friend, stood ready. Lucia carried Marco in her arms, wrapped in a grey shawl. "Will I see you again?" the boy asked. "Always," she said, forcing a smile. "In your dreams, I'll be near." They were about to leave when a shout echoed across the fields. Torches flared in the distance. Soldiers. Antonio cursed under his breath. "They've come sooner than I thought." Lucia's heart pounded. "What do we do?" "Run," he said. "Take the path through the vineyards. I'll lead them away." "No, Antonio." But he was already moving toward the road, shouting to draw their attention. "This way, over here!" Lucia gathered Marco and ran. The vines brushed against her skirt, the ground slick with dew. Behind her, voices shouted, boots thudded, dogs barked. The torches grew brighter. She stumbled once, clutching the child to her chest. "Don't cry, Marco," she whispered. "We're almost safe." They reached the edge of the vineyard, where an old stone wall marked the boundary of her land. She climbed over, tearing her skirt, and hid behind the ruins of a shepherd's hut. Marco's breathing was quick, frightened, but he made no sound. Through the cracks in the wall, she saw figures moving among the vines. The torches passed close, too close. "Search every house," the captain shouted. "The Countess wants proof before dawn." Lucia held her breath. A soldier's lantern swept past the stones, lighting her face for a heartbeat. She ducked, praying he had not seen. The rain began to fall again, masking every sound. After what felt like hours, the noise faded. Lucia dared to move, slipping from the hiding place toward the forest path. Halfway down the hill, Antonio appeared, soaked and breathless. "They've gone north," he whispered. "We have a few hours." Lucia wanted to thank him, but her voice broke. She reached for his hand instead. He held it tightly, his eyes full of things neither dared to say aloud. They kept walking until the moon sank behind the hills. The road curved toward the abandoned chapel of St. Pietro, half collapsed and forgotten. Antonio pushed open the creaking door, leading her inside. "Rest here," he said. "I'll keep watch." Lucia laid Marco on a bench and covered him with her cloak. The air smelled of old stone and damp earth. She sat near the boy, exhaustion overcoming her, yet her mind raced. Antonio stood by the doorway, lantern in hand. The light flickered over his face, tired but kind. You risked everything, she said quietly. Why? Because no one should face this alone, he replied. She hesitated, then whispered, You believe I've done right, raising another woman's husband's child. I believe love can't be measured by birth, he said. You've given him what others could not. Safety, kindness, a home. Tears filled her eyes. I've lived in fear so long I've forgotten what peace feels like. Then remember tonight, he said. Remember that you are not alone. She smiled faintly, and for the first time the distance between them seemed to vanish. Outside the rain fell harder, drumming on the chapel roof. They sat in silence, the only sound Marco's soft breathing. When dawn approached, Antonio turned toward the doorway, listening. The soldiers have gone east, he said. We can move again soon. But before Lucia could reply, the church bell from the distant village rang, a deep, solemn toll that carried through the hills. She looked up, startled. What does that mean? Antonio's face turned pale. It's the castle bell. Someone of high rank is dying. They both listened as the sound echoed through the valley, slow and mournful. Then a messenger on horseback appeared on the far road, waving a scroll and shouting through the rain, The Marquis Lorenzo di Montieri calls for his son. He lies dying. Lucia's breath stopped. She held Marco close, her heart torn between dread and duty. A distant bell tolled. A messenger brought news that the Marquis Lorenzo di Montieri was gravely ill and had asked for the child who bears his name. Lucia sat in the dim chapel, her heart pounding at the messenger's cry. The sound of the bell still echoed through the hills, heavy and relentless, like fate itself demanding an answer. Antonio stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair. You heard him, he said quietly. The Marquis is dying. Lucia clutched Marco tighter. He's calling for his son, she whispered. For my boy. Antonio nodded. He must have confessed. Perhaps his conscience can't bear the secret any longer. Lucia's eyes filled with confusion and fear. If I take Marco to him, the Countess will know. She'll destroy us both. Maybe, Antonio said, but if you stay silent, the Marquis dies with the truth unspoken. What if he means to set things right? She turned to the small window where dawn broke pale over the fields. He trusted me to keep the boy hidden, to protect him. How can I betray that trust now? Antonio's voice softened. He didn't ask you to hide him forever. He asked you to keep him safe. There's a difference. Lucia stared at Marco. The child slept peacefully, unaware of the world that sought to claim him. If I go, she said slowly, I might lose him. Antonio looked at her, steady and calm. If you don't, he'll grow up never knowing who he is. For a long moment, Lucia said nothing. Then she stood, gathering her courage like a cloak. We'll go, she decided, but not alone. Antonio nodded. I'll come with you. They set out that morning, walking the narrow road that led to the Montieri estate. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained grey, the air heavy with waiting. Marco rode on Antonio's shoulders, laughing whenever a bird darted from the hedges. Lucia watched him and prayed silently that his laughter would not be the last she ever heard. By the time they reached the castle gates, evening had fallen. 2 guards blocked the entrance, their armor dull with mist. Lucia stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. Tell the Countess that Lucia Bellini has come. The Marquis sent for his son. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them disappeared through the gates. Minutes passed before he returned. You may enter, he said, though his tone held no welcome. Inside, the castle smelled of candle smoke and medicine. Servants hurried through the corridors, whispering. Lucia followed the sound of low voices until they reached a large room where the Marquis lay on a high bed, his face drawn and pale as linen. He turned his head at the sound of footsteps. When he saw Marco, his eyes filled with tears. My boy, he murmured, his voice barely a breath. You brought him. Lucia knelt beside the bed, bowing her head. I came because you called, my lord. The Marquis reached out a trembling hand, resting it on the child's hair. I've done you wrong, Lucia. I gave you my sin and called it a favor. Yet you gave that sin a soul and made it pure. Lucia could barely speak. I did only what any mother would. No, he whispered. You did what his true mother could not. You gave him life. He turned to Antonio, who stood quietly by the door. You're the teacher. You know truth when you see it. Bear witness for him. The boy is mine. My lord, Antonio said gently. I will tell it if I must. The Marquis's breathing grew shallow. There is a paper, my confession. It names him as my heir. But it must be signed. He struggled to lift his hand, reaching for the table beside his bed, where a document lay waiting. But before he could take the pen, the door opened. Countess Isabella entered, her gown black as mourning, though her husband still lived. Her eyes blazed when she saw Lucia and the child. "What is this?" she hissed. "What insolence brings you here?" Lucia rose slowly. "He sent for us." The Marquis wished to see his son. His son! Isabella's laugh was sharp as glass. "You dare bring your bastard into my house and speak of him as my husband's child?" The Marquis tried to speak, but his breath caught. "Isabella." "Enough," she turned on him. "Enough. You humiliated me before the whole province. And now, on your deathbed, you would crown your shame with an heir born of filth." Lucia's face flushed, but she said nothing. She clutched Marco's hand tightly, shielding him with her body. Isabella strode to the bed, her voice trembling with fury. "You will not sign that paper, I forbid it." The Marquis's eyes burned with the last of his strength. "You cannot forbid truth." She glared at him, her voice rising. "You've ruined our name once. I will not let you ruin it again." He tried to lift the pen, but his fingers failed him. The paper slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor. His chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. Lucia gasped. Isabella froze, her mouth open in shock. For a moment, the room was silent except for the wind rattling the shutters. Then Isabella turned, her face pale but her eyes cold. "Take them away," she said to the servants. "They have no place here." The servants hesitated, looking to Antonio. He stepped between Lucia and the Countess. The Marquis sent for her. He declared the boy his son. "Without a signature, his words mean nothing," Isabella said sharply. "And you, sir, will hold your tongue if you value your position." Antonio met her gaze. "I value truth more than comfort." Her lips curled. "Then you'll lose both." Guards entered, moving toward Lucia. She backed away, clutching Marco, her heart pounding. "Please, madam," she said. "He's just a child." "A mistake," Isabella spat. "One that will be forgotten." Antonio moved closer to Lucia. "Run," he whispered. Lucia didn't wait. She snatched the medallion from her pocket and slipped past the guards. Antonio blocked their path, forcing them back with words and sheer will. Lucia fled down the corridor, Marco in her arms, her breath ragged. Behind her, Isabella's voice rang out. "Find them. I want that woman arrested." Lucia reached the stables, where the smell of hay and horses filled the air. She climbed into a wagon and urged the animal forward. The wheels rolled, bumping over the cobblestones, faster and faster. By the time she reached the village road, her tears had already dried. Marco clung to her neck, frightened but silent. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked. "Somewhere safe," she said. "Far from here." That night they returned to Antonio's house. He arrived soon after, breathless but unharmed. "She'll search for you," he said, "but we'll find a way to make the truth known." Lucia shook her head. "The paper is lost. Without it we have nothing." "Not nothing," Antonio said, holding up the medallion. "This is proof enough to begin." She frowned. "Proof of what?" "Of lineage," he said, "and I know where to find a witness. The priest who baptized Marco. He may remember something." Lucia grasped his hand. "You would stand against her for me?" "For you," he said softly. "And for him." They left before dawn to speak with Father Tommaso, who listened in silence as Lucia told everything. When she finished, the old priest sighed. "I remember that night," he said. "The Marquis came in secret, cloaked and trembling. He made me swear to record no name, but I baptized the child myself." Lucia's eyes filled with hope. "Then you can tell the court?" "If truth demands it," the priest said. "But beware, the Countess has power, and power does not yield easily." Antonio nodded. "We'll face her. The people will hear the truth even if the law pretends deafness." The priest blessed them both, but his voice trembled. "Go carefully. The Countess's wrath is a storm, and storms break what stands in their way." When they stepped outside, the morning sun was bright but cold. Lucia held Marco's hand, feeling strength return to her limbs. "I won't hide any more," she said. "Let her do her worst." But her resolve was soon tested. The next day, soldiers arrived in Montieri with a proclamation sealed in blue wax. The herald read it aloud in the square. By command of Countess Isabella di Montieri, all persons harboring or aiding the woman Lucia Bellini and the child called Marco are guilty of fraud and defamation of the noble house. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned away in fear, others whispered prayers. Antonio stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. Then I, Antonio Bardi, stand guilty too. For I believe the child is rightful blood of Montieri, and no law can erase that truth. The herald scowled. Then you'll answer before the magistrate. Gladly, Antonio replied. Let him hear our witness and judge for himself. Lucia watched him, her heart full of fear and gratitude. The road ahead was dark, but she was no longer walking it alone. As the soldiers prepared to escort them to the city for trial, Marco clung to her hand. Mamma, will they hurt us? No, my love, she said, forcing a calm she did not feel. They'll listen. The truth will protect us. Antonio met her eyes. And if truth fails, we will not. They were taken toward the city under the grey sky, surrounded by silence and the sound of distant bells. As Lucia looked back at the fading hills of Montieri, she felt both fear and strange peace, like a woman walking through the last shadow before dawn. As Lucia gathered her shawl to leave the magistrate's hall, the Countess's steward stepped forward and produced the Marquis's medallion, proof that could either condemn or save them. Lucia froze when she saw the medallion gleaming in the steward's hand. The small piece of gold, once hidden under her roof, now shone like a trap. The magistrate's chamber was silent, except for the creak of the steward's boots, as he stepped forward and placed it on the table before them. This, he said solemnly, was found among the possessions of the accused. It bears the crest of House Montieri. The magistrate, a stout man with tired eyes, examined it. And you claim this proves the child's noble birth? The Countess, standing tall and still, smiled coldly. It proves theft and deceit. My husband's medallion was stolen the night he disappeared from the castle. The woman before you, this seamstress, kept it to lend false weight to her lies. Lucia felt Antonio's hand tighten around hers. She looked at the magistrate, trying to find her voice. My lord, the Marquis himself gave it to me. The night he brought me the child. He asked me to protect him. The Countess gave a sharp laugh. A likely story. My husband was a man of honor. He would never place a bastard in the care of a peasant. Antonio stepped forward. I was there when she told the truth. The Marquis confessed his sin before his death. He declared the boy his son. The magistrate frowned. Do you have witnesses to this confession? Lucia hesitated, then said, Only Father Tommaso. He baptized the boy that same night. The Countess turned sharply. Produce him then, if such a priest exists. The magistrate nodded. Let him be summoned. A clerk hurried out. The hall murmured as people shifted in their seats. The villagers had come to watch, their faces anxious, torn between sympathy and fear. While they waited, the Countess paced slowly, her voice cutting through the room. I have endured many things, she said. Whispers about my husband's faithfulness, tales of a village woman favored by fortune. But this attempt to usurp my house's honor will end today. Lucia looked at her, trembling but resolute. My lady, I never wished harm to you or your name. I only kept the promise your husband made me swear, to protect the boy. Protect him? Isabella's eyes flashed. You mean to profit from him? You've taught him to speak above his place, to dream beyond his blood. Antonio spoke before Lucia could answer. The boy's heart is nobler than the titles you guard, madam. If the Marquis's blood runs in his veins, it only proves that virtue can grow even in exile. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The magistrate struck his gavel. Enough. The priest will speak for truth, not emotion. The doors opened then, and Father Tommaso entered, leaning on his cane. His robe was damp from rain, his face pale but composed. He bowed slightly to the magistrate. Father, said the magistrate, you are called to witness. Did you baptize a child under the Marquis's command? The priest nodded slowly. I did. The Countess stiffened. Impossible. Tommaso continued, his voice trembling but clear. One night, many years ago, the Marquis came to me in secrecy. He brought a woman, weary and frightened, carrying a newborn. He asked me to baptize the child quietly, without record. I agreed, for the man's sorrow moved me. I gave the boy the name Marco. The magistrate leaned forward. "And you saw this woman again?" "Yes," said the priest, turning toward Lucia. "She is the same." Lucia's eyes filled with tears. The hall stirred again. The countess's voice rose. "You lie! My husband would not conspire with a priest behind my back." Tommaso's gaze met hers. "He did, my lady, for he feared your wrath more than God's judgment." The magistrate rapped the gavel again, silencing the uproar. "We have heard both sides. The evidence is strong that the child may indeed be the Marquis's blood." The countess took a step forward, her composure cracking. "You would believe a poor woman and a trembling priest over a noble's widow. You dishonor the house of Montieri." Antonio lifted his chin. The house dishonored itself the moment it abandoned an innocent child. "Silence," she cried. Lucia's voice broke through, steady and low. "You have everything: wealth, land, respect. I have only him. If truth belongs to anyone, it should belong to the innocent, not the powerful." The magistrate studied her face. The silence stretched. Then he turned to his clerk. "Record this hearing. The boy shall remain in his mother's care until further decree. The estate must review the Marquis's papers for any mention of him." The countess's face turned white with rage. "You condemn me to shame." "I preserve justice," the magistrate said. Isabella gathered her skirts and strode toward the door, her voice cold and trembling. "This is not over. If the law cannot silence her, time will." The guards followed her out. The moment she was gone, the tension in the room dissolved. Villagers whispered prayers. Others murmured praise for Lucia's courage. Antonio exhaled for the first time in hours. "It's done. For now." Lucia sank onto the nearest bench, trembling with relief. "We survived." Father Tommaso laid a hand on her shoulder. "You did more than survive, child. You spoke truth before those who fear it." The magistrate rose from his chair. "Go home, Signora Bellini. The law will decide what the Marquis's will concealed. But know this, the people saw your heart today." Lucia thanked him softly. She turned to Antonio. "Will you walk with us?" "Always," he said. They left the hall together. Outside, the air smelled of rain and earth. Marco skipped between them, unaware of the storm that had nearly torn his world apart. In the square, people gathered around them, offering quiet smiles and nods of respect. For years they had shunned Lucia, but now they looked at her differently. One woman whispered, "She faced the countess and lived." God bless her. Lucia felt warmth rise in her chest, though fear lingered. "She won't stop," she said to Antonio. "Not while she breathes." He nodded. "Then we'll stay ready." That night they returned to her cottage. The fire burned low, casting golden light on the walls. Marco played on the floor with wooden blocks, while Lucia mended a torn sleeve. Antonio sat nearby, watching her quietly. "You're trembling," he said. "I'm tired," she admitted. "So many years I've lived in silence. Today I spoke, and it feels like waking from a dream." He smiled faintly. "Dreams end, so we can see daylight." She looked at him then, her eyes soft but uncertain. "You've risked everything for me. Your name, your work. Why?" Antonio hesitated. "Because I believe in truth. And in you." Lucia lowered her gaze. "You shouldn't." "Too late," he said gently. The silence between them was full of unspoken words. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too small for what he had done. Instead, she reached for Marco and kissed his forehead. "You're safe," she whispered. "That's what matters." For a while, peace seemed possible. Days passed without sight of soldiers or messengers. The countess retreated to her estate, nursing her fury in silence. Antonio resumed teaching, and Marco returned to his studies. But peace is fragile when built on a storm's edge. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, a rider arrived from the city, dust clinging to his cloak. He dismounted at Lucia's door and handed her a sealed parchment. "From the magistrate," he said. Lucia broke the seal. The letter inside bore the official stamp of Montieri. Her eyes scanned the words, and she nearly dropped the page. "What is it?" Antonio asked. "They found the Marquis's will," she whispered. He wrote of a child unnamed but described as the son of my heart. He left a sum for his education and care. Antonio smiled faintly. Then justice speaks after all. But Lucia's hands trembled. The Countess will never allow it. She'll see this as defeat. Then she's already lost, Antonio said. That night, the air outside was still and heavy. The moon rose pale over the vineyards. Lucia stood by the window, watching shadows drift along the path. Every rustle made her flinch. In the distance, a horse neighed. She thought she saw movement by the gate, but when she stepped outside, there was only wind. The next morning, Father Tommaso came with news. The Countess has fallen ill, he said quietly. They say her heart is failing. Lucia's expression softened. May God grant her peace. She asked for no priest, the old man added. Some say guilt is her sickness. Lucia sighed. Perhaps it is. For the first time in years, she walked through the village without fear. Children waved at Marco, calling him little scholar. The baker's wife offered bread with a smile instead of a whisper. Still, Lucia could not shake the feeling that fate was not done with them. When she reached the square, she saw a messenger from Siena posting a notice on the church door. It bore the royal seal. Antonio read it aloud. By order of the regional court, the estate of Montieri shall review all claims of inheritance. Those with rightful testimony must appear within 7 days. Lucia met his gaze. We must go. He nodded. And this time, we'll go as we are. Not hiding, not begging. As truth itself, she took a deep breath. The journey to Siena would be long, but she no longer feared the road. Marco's small hand slipped into hers, and Antonio walked beside them. As they turned toward the path that led out of Montieri, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. Sunlight broke through the clouds, warm and bright on the vineyards. Lucia lifted her face to it, feeling the promise of something new, something like freedom. But just as they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, a figure stepped out from behind a tree, dressed in dark riding clothes, eyes cold and unblinking. It was the Countess's steward, and in his hand he held the parchment that bore the Marquis' seal. He bowed slightly and said, "The Countess sends her regards. She wishes to settle this matter, personally." Lucia stepped back, pulling Marco close. Antonio moved in front of them instinctively, his jaw tightening as the steward approached. The man's expression was calm, almost courteous, but there was something behind his eyes, a warning, or perhaps pity. "Her ladyship regrets her former harshness," the steward said. "She wishes to speak with you in private to end this dispute without the courts. The Countess is ill, and does not wish her name dragged through further scandal." Antonio's eyes narrowed. "Ill or not, she's never sought peace before. Why now?" The steward lowered his gaze. "Because she fears death, signor, and the weight of what the Marquis confessed before he died." "Will you deny a dying woman the chance to set things right?" Lucia's heart pounded. "If I go, how do I know I'll return?" "I give you my word," said the steward. "You and the child will be safe. The Countess wishes only to speak." Antonio shook his head. "Her word is worth less than the ink on her seals. You're not going alone, Lucia." The steward hesitated, then nodded. "The Countess said you might insist on bringing your protector." "Very well. But the child must come too. She wants to see him." Lucia's breath caught. "To see him. She said she must." The steward replied quietly. "Before it's too late." Antonio glanced at Lucia. It could be a trap. She nodded, but her voice was steady. "Even so, I must go. If she truly means to end this, then Marco deserves to be known." The journey to the castle was silent. The road wound through fields washed in pale light. The vineyards glistened from the morning dew, and every sound, the creak of the cart, the cry of a bird, seemed louder in the quiet. When the castle gates opened, Lucia felt the same chill she had felt years ago when the Marquis first appeared at her door. The steward led them inside, through corridors dimly lit by oil lamps. The scent of herbs and candle wax filled the air. In a grand chamber, Countess Isabella sat by a window, her once proud figure frail beneath a shawl. The years had softened her face, but not her eyes. They still gleamed with a sharpness that time could not dull. "So," she said, her voice thin but clear. "You've come." Lucia bowed slightly. "You sent for us, my lady." The Countess looked at Marco, who stood half-hidden behind Antonio. For a long time she said nothing. Then she gestured to a chair. "Bring the boy closer. I want to see what sin looks like when it grows." Antonio started forward. "My lady—" "Let her," Lucia whispered. She led Marco forward, her hand on his shoulder. The Countess studied him closely. "How old are you?" "10, my lady," the boy answered politely. She tilted her head, as though the words confirmed something she already knew. "You have your father's eyes," she said softly, "and his quiet defiance." Marco frowned. "Did you know my father?" For a moment pain flickered across her face. "I knew him too well." Then her tone hardened. "Tell me, Lucia Bellini, do you teach him that he's noble? That he has a claim to my house?" Lucia met her gaze. "I teach him only truth, that he was born of love, and that his father cared for him, even from afar." The Countess smiled bitterly. "Love, the word peasants use when they trespass above their place." Antonio stepped forward. "My lady, if you called us here to wound her, then we will leave." But Isabella raised her hand. "Stay. I did not call you here for vengeance. I am dying, and I would leave this world without lies. The will my husband wrote, I destroyed it. It named the boy, though not by name. I burned it the night he breathed his last." Lucia gasped. "Then everything is lost?" "No," Isabella said slowly. "What's lost to parchment can still be restored by word. The court will listen to me now because I am dying. I can tell them the truth if I choose." Antonio studied her carefully. "And what do you want in return?" The Countess looked toward the window, where the light flickered on the floor. Silence. "When I'm gone, let the world remember me as I was, the loyal wife, not the jealous one. Swear to me that no one will speak of this again." Lucia hesitated. "If I swear that, Marco will never bear his true name." "Then give him another," said Isabella. "Let him live free of shame and of pride alike. The Montieri lands are cursed by both." Marco looked between them, confused. "Mama, why are we here? Who is she?" Lucia knelt and held his face. "Someone who once loved your father, my dear, and someone who can help us if she wishes." The Countess's lips trembled. "He should not hate me." "He doesn't," Lucia said softly. "He doesn't know how." For a moment the Countess seemed to crumble. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "I loved Lorenzo once, but he was not mine, not truly. Perhaps that was my punishment." Antonio watched her closely. "Then you mean to set things right?" She nodded weakly. "The magistrate will receive my statement tomorrow. I will declare that my husband acknowledged a son before his death. The boy will not bear the title, but his rights to inheritance will be honored. That is all I can give." Lucia's eyes filled with tears. "That is more than I dared hope for." "Do not thank me," Isabella murmured. "I do this for him, not for you. And for peace. Mine, not yours." The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rumbled far away. The Countess sank back in her chair, breathing with effort. Lucia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "My lady, would you like to bless him before we go?" The Countess hesitated, then nodded. Marco approached, uncertain but obedient. She touched his hair with a shaking hand. "Be wiser than your father," she whispered, "and kinder than I have been." He smiled shyly. "Thank you, my lady." When they left the castle, the air felt heavy but clean. Lucia walked in silence, holding Marco's hand while Antonio walked beside her. "She'll keep her word," he said quietly. "You saw it in her face." "I did," Lucia replied, "but I also saw regret. It's a heavy thing to carry." "She's carried worse," Antonio said. "Now it's done." For the first time in years, Lucia felt a strange calm settle over her. The clouds that had hung above her life seemed to thin. She looked at Antonio and said, "You've stood by me when no one else would. I owe you more than I can repay." He shook his head. "You owe me nothing. Perhaps it's I who owe you. You've reminded me why truth matters." That night, they returned home. The cottage glowed with the warmth of the fire, and Marco soon fell asleep on the rug, his hand clutching the wooden horse Antonio had carved for him. Lucia watched the flames dance and whispered, "Do you think he'll remember all this?" Antonio smiled faintly. "He'll remember the love. The rest will fade like rain on the fields." She turned to him, her heart full. "When the court settles everything, what then? What will you do?" "I'll stay," he said simply. "If you'll have me here." Lucia looked away, blushing slightly. "You would trade Florence for Montieri. I'd trade silence for peace," he said. "And I find both when I'm near you." She wanted to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she smiled, a quiet, uncertain smile, and poured him a cup of wine. For several weeks, the village lived in a hush. The Countess's health declined, but no word came from the castle. Then one morning, a messenger arrived, bearing the seal of the magistrate. Lucia's hands trembled as she broke it open. It was a copy of the Countess's final statement, sealed with her own ring. It declared Marco to be the Marquis's natural son and granted him a modest inheritance to be managed by Lucia until his majority. Antonio read it aloud, his voice steady but full of feeling. She kept her word. Lucia pressed her hand to her mouth. "Then it's over." "Not over," Antonio said. "Begun anew." She smiled through tears. A new beginning, then. That evening, they buried the last letter from the Marquis beneath the old olive tree behind the cottage. Lucia whispered a prayer for his soul and another for the woman who had at last found peace. For the first time in years, the air smelled only of spring, of earth and hope. Antonio turned to her. "Now you can rest, Lucia." "Perhaps," she said softly. "But I've learned that peace never lasts forever." As if to answer her, a knock sounded at the door. Marco looked up from his book. "Who is it, Mama?" Lucia frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Stay here, both of you." When she opened the door, a young officer stood there in the dusk, holding a folded document stamped with the royal seal of Tuscany. He bowed slightly. "Forgive the hour, Signora, but I bring orders from Florence. The court requests your presence, and the child's. There's been a dispute about the Countess's final testimony." Lucia stood in the doorway, staring at the officer as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Behind her, Marco and Antonio waited in silence. "A dispute?" she repeated quietly. But the Countess's statement was signed, sealed. What could they dispute now? The young man shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Signora. The notice comes directly from Florence. They claim a second version of her declaration has appeared, one that contradicts the first. You are required to appear before the regional magistrate within 3 days." Antonio's voice sharpened. "A forged document, then. Someone's trying to erase her last act of mercy." The officer hesitated. "I'm only a messenger, but I would advise caution on your journey. Travel is not safe for those who draw attention from noble houses." Lucia's heart thudded in her chest. "We'll go," she said finally. "We have nothing to hide." After the officer left, Antonio paced the room. "It could be a trap," he said. "If someone within the estate forged a new paper, they'll use the law to undo everything." Lucia sat down, weary but resolved. "I can't hide forever. The truth doesn't change because they wish it to." Marco looked between them, his eyes wide. "Are we going back to the city, Mama?" "Yes," she said softly. "But this time, we go to end it for good." 3 mornings later, they set out at dawn. The road to Florence wound through fields of olive trees and vineyards heavy with mist. Marco rode in the wagon's back, humming softly, while Antonio guided the reins. Lucia watched the sky lighten, her mind full of the Countess's dying face and the strange peace she had left behind. When they reached the city gates, guards examined their summons carefully before allowing them to pass. The magistrate's hall stood near the Arno River, grand and grey beneath the November sky. Inside, the air smelled of ink and candle wax. They were led into a large chamber lined with tall windows. The same magistrate from Montieri sat at the centre, his expression grim. Beside him stood a clerk holding 2 sealed letters. Lucia recognized the wax crest on one. It bore the Countess's personal seal. The other was marked only with the Montieri emblem. The magistrate looked up as they entered. "Signora Bellini, Signor Bardi, you have returned to answer a challenge to the Countess's final testimony." Antonio nodded. "We are ready to hear the accusation." The magistrate motioned to the clerk, who unrolled a parchment. "This document, received from the Montieri estate, claims to be a later declaration written by the Countess 2 days before her death. It revokes the recognition of a natural son and affirms that the Marquis left no legitimate or illegitimate heir." Lucia gasped. "That cannot be true. She signed her confession before witnesses." The magistrate's voice softened. And yet this new document bears her signature as well. Antonio stepped forward. Forgery. You can see the difference in the ink, the line of the hand. The magistrate nodded slightly. That is what we must determine. He turned to Lucia. Do you still possess the original statement? Lucia held it out with trembling fingers. This is her true word. It came to me through the magistrate of Montieri himself. The clerk accepted it and placed both documents side by side. The magistrate studied them for several minutes. The seals differ, he said at last. One bears her ring, the other only the crest. It is possible this later copy was made without her knowledge. Antonio said quietly, someone in the household wanted to restore the shame she tried to erase. The magistrate looked thoughtful. The steward of the Montieri estate. He was close to her, was he not? Lucia's eyes darkened. Too close, perhaps. He brought me her first letter, the one asking for peace. Then we must hear from him, the magistrate said. He called for a guard. Send for Cesare Lippi, steward of the late Countess Isabella di Montieri. While they waited, the hall grew tense. Marco sat quietly beside his mother, his small hands folded in his lap. Lucia touched his shoulder. Don't be afraid, she whispered. The truth always finds its voice. Antonio glanced at her and smiled faintly, even when the world tries to silence it. Moments later, the doors opened. Cesare entered, dressed in mourning black. He bowed stiffly. My lord magistrate. The magistrate gestured toward the two letters. You served the countess until her death. I did. Did she dictate either of these documents in your presence? The steward's eyes flicked to Lucia. I saw her sign one paper, he said slowly. She asked me to seal it, though she was weak. I do not know which this is. Antonio stepped closer. You don't know? You carried the first to us yourself. Cesare stiffened. I carried what she gave me. Lucia's voice trembled with anger. And after she died, you forged another. The steward's face flushed. I would not dare. The magistrate's tone sharpened. You will answer truthfully. Did anyone else have access to her seal after her death? Cesare hesitated. Perhaps the physician. He oversaw her belongings before burial, and her nephew, Count Vitale, arrived 2 days after she passed. Antonio frowned. She had a nephew? Yes, the steward said reluctantly. A distant relative from Pisa. He inherits the estate by law if the child is discredited. Lucia's heart sank. So he had reason to destroy her word. The magistrate sighed. It seems likely. Yet without proof, I cannot convict him. Antonio said firmly, then summon him. Let him face her handwriting. The magistrate nodded to a guard. Bring Count Vitale Montieri. The wait was long. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, turning the marble floor gold. Lucia sat motionless, Marco resting against her side. Antonio paced slowly, thinking. At last, the Count entered. He was a man of 30, tall with sharp features and a cold smile. You sent for me, my lord. The magistrate gestured to the papers. 2 documents bear your aunt's seal. We must know which is genuine. Vitale gave a polite nod. I can save you the trouble. The later document is authentic. I found it among her things. My aunt regretted her first statement. She told me so before she died. Lucia rose. Liar. She made peace before God that day. She asked only for silence after truth. The Count's smile didn't waver, and she changed her mind when death drew nearer. Can you swear you were there when she wrote this second letter? Antonio stepped forward. Can you? The Count's eyes flicked to him. Careful, schoolmaster, the court frowns on insolence. The magistrate raised a hand. Enough. We will settle this by comparison. He turned to the clerk. Fetch the expert from the notary's office. A thin man entered soon after, carrying spectacles and a small magnifying glass. He examined both documents in silence, tracing the ink, the curves of each letter. At last, he straightened and bowed. My lord, these were not written by the same hand. The second is a forgery. The signature imitates hers but lacks the pressure of age and weakness visible in the first. A murmur rose through the hall. The magistrate nodded gravely. So declared. Lucia closed her eyes in relief. Antonio exhaled softly beside her. The magistrate turned to Vitale. You brought a false document before this court. You will answer for this deceit. Vitali's face went pale. I only delivered what was found in her study, where no one but you had entered, the magistrate said. You will remain under guard until inquiry concludes. The Count protested, but the guards seized his arms and led him away. When the doors closed, the magistrate looked at Lucia. The law now stands as the Countess declared. The child's inheritance and rights will be honored. Lucia bowed her head. Thank you, my lord, Antonio said quietly. You've given justice to both the living and the dead. The magistrate smiled faintly. Sometimes they are the same. As they left the hall, the city seemed brighter, the air clearer. Marco skipped ahead, laughing as pigeons scattered from the steps. Lucia turned to Antonio. It's over, he nodded, though his expression was distant. Yes. And yet, endings often feel like beginnings, she smiled softly. Perhaps because they are. They returned to the village a week later, greeted not by suspicion but by celebration. The bells of Montieri rang as they passed through the square. The villagers cheered, offering bread, flowers, and blessings. Lucia thanked them, tears shining in her eyes. For the first time in 10 years, she walked without fear of shame. That evening, Antonio stood with her outside the cottage. The sky blazed red over the hills. The boy will grow strong, he said. He'll have his chance to study, to travel, maybe even to teach. Lucia smiled. He has your patience and his father's will. I'll be content just to watch him live. Antonio looked at her then, the setting sun reflected in his eyes. And what of you, Lucia? You've carried everyone's burdens but your own. Don't you deserve peace too? She hesitated. Peace, perhaps. But I wouldn't know what to do with it. He stepped closer. Then let me show you. Before she could answer, footsteps approached from the path. Father Tommaso appeared, breathless and holding a letter. My child, he said urgently. A messenger came from Florence. The magistrate asks you to return immediately. The Marquis's will has been found, complete and sealed. It mentions another name you must hear. Lucia's breath caught. Another name, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Father Tommaso nodded, still winded from his walk. The magistrate did not say more, only that it concerns the inheritance and your son's future. You must go at once. He awaits you tomorrow in Florence. Antonio frowned. Another name could mean another heir. Lucia's hands trembled. Or another truth. The priest placed a comforting hand on her arm. Whatever it means, child, you've walked this far with courage. Do not falter now. That night, Lucia packed little more than clothes and the worn wooden toy Marco never traveled without. Antonio helped her harness the horse. The air smelled of lavender and damp earth. The village slept while they prepared to face whatever waited beyond the hills. Before dawn, they set out again. Marco dozed in the back of the cart, while Lucia sat beside Antonio, her fingers twisting in her lap. What could be in that will? She asked. The Marquis's letter, his medallion, the priest's word, all said the same thing. What else could matter now? Antonio kept his eyes on the road. The law likes its puzzles, Lucia. Sometimes a truth must come twice before men believe it. They arrived at the magistrate's hall by mid-afternoon. Servants recognized them and led them through a quieter corridor than before. When they entered the chamber, the magistrate rose from his seat. His expression was kind, though weariness lined his face. Signora Bellini, he greeted her. Thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit. Lucia obeyed. Antonio stood beside her, watchful as ever. The magistrate took a sealed parchment from the table and laid it carefully before them. This document was found hidden in a chest belonging to the late Marquis. It was preserved by his steward and delivered by order of the court. It appears to be his final will, written in his own hand and witnessed by 2 servants. Lucia's heart pounded. Does it speak of the boy? It does, said the magistrate, but also of another person. He unfolded the parchment and read aloud, To my beloved son Marco, born of my true affection and the kindness of Lucia Bellini, I leave the inheritance of my personal estate, land, income, and protection, and to Antonio Bardi, whose conscience and intellect I once admired, I entrust his education and guardianship should misfortune befall his mother. Lucia's eyes widened. Antonio? Antonio stared in disbelief. He wrote my name? The magistrate nodded. It seems the Marquis knew of you, perhaps through his steward or the priest. Your work as a teacher was known in the province. He must have chosen you as guardian for the child's future. Lucia turned to Antonio. Then it was fate that you came to Montieri. You were meant to protect him. Antonio smiled faintly. Or perhaps fate waited for us to choose what was already written. The magistrate continued reading. There is more. The Marquis requests that the Countess, if she survives him, show mercy to those he wronged. He confesses to loving a woman not of his class, a woman of compassion, whose name he conceals for her safety. He calls her the keeper of my heart's truth. Lucia covered her mouth. He meant me. The magistrate folded the parchment gently. The Countess's confession confirms this. Together they leave no doubt. The inheritance is yours to manage until Marco's maturity. His status as heir to the Marquis's private fortune is hereby recognized under Florentine law. Lucia exhaled slowly, tears brimming. Then at last it's finished. Almost, said the magistrate. The court must seal the will before witnesses. I have summoned the village priest to verify the Marquis's handwriting. Once done, the estate shall release funds for the boy's schooling and the preservation of your property. Antonio bowed slightly. You have been just, my lord. The magistrate smiled. Justice sometimes moves with slow feet, but it does arrive. After signing their names, Lucia stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was bright, the air heavy with the scent of olives and stone. Marco ran to her and threw his arms around her waist. Mama, are we free now? Lucia knelt, pressing his cheek against hers. Yes, my love, free and safe. Antonio watched them quietly, his heart tightening with something deeper than joy. When Lucia rose, their eyes met, and for a moment words seemed unnecessary. They spent the night in a small inn near the river. Lucia could not sleep. She sat by the window watching the reflections of lanterns on the water. Antonio joined her after a while, carrying a candle. You should rest, he said gently. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see the Marquis's face. I hear his voice saying, keep him safe. I wonder if I've done enough. You've done everything, Antonio said, more than anyone else could. She looked at him, her eyes soft. And why did you stay, Antonio? You could have left when the scandal began. You owed me nothing. He hesitated, then said quietly, because you gave me something I didn't know I needed. Purpose. I thought teaching was my life. Then I met you, and I learned what courage looks like. Lucia felt her throat tighten. You speak as if courage and fear walk together. They do, he replied. Only those who fear truly know what bravery means. Their hands brushed, then lingered. Neither moved away. The candle flickered between them, painting soft light across their faces. Outside, the wind carried the faint toll of a distant bell, slow, solemn, yet peaceful. The next morning they returned to Montieri. The villagers gathered to hear the news. Father Tommaso read aloud the Marquis's will in the square, his voice trembling with joy. When he finished, the people cheered. God bless the boy, someone shouted. And his mother. Lucia smiled through her tears. For the first time she felt no shame in their gaze. That evening, she walked through the vineyards with Antonio. The air was cool and full of the scent of ripening grapes. Marco ran ahead, chasing the first fireflies of summer. He's growing fast, Antonio said. He'll soon outlearn me. Lucia laughed softly. He has your mind. You should see how he argues with his lessons. Even I lose to him now. Antonio smiled. Good. Let him grow strong enough to question everything, even fate. Lucia looked out over the hills. I used to think fate was cruel, but perhaps it's just patient. He studied her profile, the sunlight tracing her hair. Or perhaps it was waiting for you to forgive yourself. She turned to him, surprised. Forgive myself? For loving a man you couldn't have. For raising a child the world called sin. For surviving when you thought you'd broken. Her voice was barely a whisper. And what if I still don't know how? Then let me teach you, he said softly. They stood there for a long moment, the silence tender between them. She didn't pull away this time. Days turned into weeks. The estate's funds arrived, and with them came a quiet stability that Lucia had never known. She repaired the roof, planted new vines, and began teaching the village girls to sew. Marco studied under Antonio, who found new joy in his work. One afternoon, as they were closing the school, a messenger from Siena arrived. He carried a simple envelope addressed to Lucia. She broke the seal and read aloud. By order of the court, the inheritance of the late Marquis Lorenzo di Montieri is hereby confirmed to his natural son, Marco Bellini, under the guardianship of Lucia Bellini and Antonio Bardi. The estate recognizes their stewardship and honors their service to the Montieri name. Antonio grinned. Then it's official. The last shadow is gone. Lucia folded the letter carefully. No, she said softly, smiling. It's only changed shape. Shadows are part of light, after all. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Marco drew pictures of castles and vineyards, dreaming aloud of becoming an architect. Lucia watched him, pride glowing in her eyes. Antonio leaned close. He'll build what others only imagine, Lucia smiled. Then he truly is his father's son. The sound of laughter filled the cottage. It was a sound untouched by fear, full of promise and life. But as the fire burned low, there came another knock on the door. Lucia opened it to find a man in a long traveling coat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He bowed respectfully. "Forgive the intrusion, signora," he said. "I come from Florence. The magistrate sends urgent word. Before the will is sealed in the royal archive, the court requests that you and your son attend one final hearing to hear a testimony left behind by the Marquis himself." Lucia's hand trembled as she held the folded note. The messenger bowed slightly, waiting in the doorway. "A testimony?" she asked, her voice faint. "From the Marquis himself?" "Yes, signora," the man replied. "It was discovered in a sealed drawer of his private study, locked these many years. The magistrate ordered it opened only after the estate's disputes were settled. You are requested to come within 2 days to hear it read." Antonio stepped forward. "Did they say what kind of testimony?" The messenger shook his head. "Only that it concerns both the woman named Lucia Bellini and her son." Lucia felt the air leave her lungs. "Thank you," she whispered. When the man was gone, silence filled the cottage. The fire crackled softly, throwing golden light over Marco's drawings on the table. Antonio placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want to go?" Lucia stared into the flames. "He's been gone so long. What words could he still have for us? Perhaps his last ones," Antonio said gently. She looked at him, her eyes uncertain. "And if those words undo everything?" He smiled faintly. "Truth never undoes what's built on love." 2 mornings later, they set out once again. The road to Florence felt different this time, quieter, softer. The land was green with early summer, and Marco chattered about the fields and the travelers they passed. Lucia tried to smile at his excitement, though her heart tightened with every turn of the wheels. When they arrived, the magistrate greeted them with unexpected warmth. "Signora Bellini," he said. "Signor Bardi, I'm grateful you've come. The Marquis's testimony is unlike any I've seen. It's written not as a legal record, but as a confession of the heart." Lucia's voice shook. "Then it's personal." "Deeply," the magistrate replied. "You'll hear it from the notary who transcribed it." They were led into a small room lined with shelves of parchment and leather-bound ledgers. A notary, grey-haired and solemn, sat behind a table with a single sealed envelope before him. He rose as they entered. "By order of the court," he began, "this letter is to be read in the presence of Lucia Bellini and her guardianship circle. It was written by Marquis Lorenzo di Montieri on the eve of his final illness." Lucia reached for Antonio's hand under the table. Marco sat between them, silent but wide-eyed. The notary broke the seal and began to read. "To whom this reaches, and to the woman who once took my sin and turned it into grace, this is my final truth." The notary's voice was calm, but the words filled the room like the echo of a prayer. "When I left that night in the storm, I left behind more than a child. I left behind my peace. My wife knew nothing of the woman I loved, but she knew of my guilt. And in her silence she punished me more than anger could have. Lucia, you must know, she was not the only one who paid the price of my weakness. You did. And for that, I owe you a debt no man can repay." Lucia bowed her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. The notary continued, "I have watched from afar through those who still served me faithfully, and I learned of your kindness, the way you raised him, the way you bore shame and hardship without complaint. You have done what I could not. You gave our son a soul untainted by pride." The notary paused, looking at her. "There is more," he said softly. "I name Marco not only as my heir-in-law, but as the heir to my conscience. Let him remember that the world measures men by birth, but heaven measures them by mercy. Tell him his father was a coward who found courage too late, and that his mother's love redeemed him in death." Lucia covered her mouth. Marco's hand slipped into hers. "Is there more?" Antonio asked quietly. The notary nodded. "One final line." He unfolded the paper again. "To Antonio Bardi, should he still live in Montieri, teach my son not to be like me. Teach him to be like you." The room went still. Antonio lowered his head, unable to speak. When the reading ended, the magistrate said softly, "This testimony will be sealed with the others. It confirms everything that has been declared. There will be no further dispute." Lucia rose slowly, her face pale but serene. "Then his voice can rest." The magistrate nodded. "As can yours, signora." Outside, the bells of the city rang the evening hour. The sound carried through the air like a benediction. They walked toward the river in silence, each step lighter than the last. Marco broke the stillness first. "Mama, what did he mean when he said you turned sin into grace?" Lucia smiled through her tears. "He meant that love can heal what mistakes cannot." Antonio touched the boy's shoulder. "And he meant that you are proof of it." They reached the bridge where the Arno shimmered gold under the fading sun. Lucia leaned on the railing, the wind lifting her hair. "Do you think he's at peace now?" she asked softly. Antonio looked out at the water. "Yes, because you forgave him long before he asked." Lucia closed her eyes. "Then maybe I can forgive myself too." He turned to her. "You already have." They stood there until the sun sank and the city lights flickered awake. Marco chased pigeons across the bridge, his laughter ringing like a promise of brighter days. That night they stayed again at the small inn by the river. Lucia fell asleep quickly, her face calm for the first time in years. Antonio sat by the window, watching the stars. He felt something in his chest shift, an ache turning at last into peace. In the morning they returned to Montieri. The village welcomed them with warmth and music. The priest announced that the Marquis's estate would grant funds to build a school, and the villagers cheered. Antonio would serve as its first master, and Lucia would teach the girls to read and sew. Life began again, simple and unhurried. The vineyard thrived, and the air filled with children's laughter. Lucia worked side by side with Antonio, her hands always busy, her eyes always bright. Marco grew tall, quick-minded and kind. He called Antonio teacher in public, but in private, sometimes father. One evening, as the harvest moon rose over the hills, Lucia and Antonio walked home from the chapel. The bells tolled softly behind them. "He's changing," Lucia said, smiling. "Soon he'll be a man." Antonio nodded. "And the world will know his name, not because of birth, but because of who he is." She looked up at him. "You've given him that." He shook his head. "No, Lucia, you did." They reached the gate of her cottage. The vines glowed silver under the moonlight. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "why God chose such a hard road for us?" Antonio thought for a moment. "Because some hearts are too strong to learn through ease. They need to be broken first, so they can be remade whole." Lucia smiled faintly. "Then ours must be very strong indeed. Or very stubborn," he said, and she laughed softly, the sound light as a breeze. He took her hand then, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. "Lucia," he said, "the past is done. The future waits. Let me walk it with you." Her breath caught. "Do you mean—" "I mean forever," he said simply, "if you'll have me." She looked into his eyes, and all the years of fear, secrecy and sorrow fell away. "Yes," she whispered. They stood there in the moonlight, the vineyard silent around them. Marco's laughter floated faintly from the cottage. Lucia leaned against Antonio's shoulder, her heart full and steady. "It seems the Marquis's last wish came true," she murmured. "He asked you to teach his son not to be like him, and you've done more. You've taught us both how to live again." Antonio smiled, pressing her hand. "Then let that be his legacy." Lucia looked toward the hills, their edges soft against the night sky. "The past lies buried," she said quietly, and the future is ours." From the distance came the sound of hooves on the road. A messenger's voice called through the evening air. "News from Florence. The court sends its blessing to the house of Montieri and its rightful heirs." The messenger's shout echoed down the lane as Lucia and Antonio turned toward the sound. Moonlight rippled over the vineyards, and the messenger galloped nearer, his horse's breath steaming in the night air. He dismounted swiftly and handed Antonio a sealed letter. "From Florence, sir. The magistrate sends his blessing. And a decree." Antonio broke the seal and read under the lantern light. His face softened into something like awe. "Lucia, they've recognized it. The Royal Council has confirmed Marco as the rightful heir to the Montieri estate. The title of Marquis will pass to him when he comes of age." Lucia's breath caught. "It's done then. Truly done." Antonio smiled, his eyes shining. "The name that once brought you sorrow will now bring him honor." Marco appeared at the cottage door, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, what's happening?" Lucia turned toward him, her heart swelling. "It's good news, my love. You're free to live as yourself. No more secrets, no more hiding." The boy blinked, half asleep, then ran to her. "So we can stay here forever?" "Yes," she said, kneeling to hold him close. "Here, where your father's spirit walks the hills and your mother's heart found peace." Antonio placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The Countess's estate will grant you the land outright. This vineyard will be yours. His father's legacy will rest where it was born. In your hands." Lucia rose slowly, the letter trembling between her fingers. "Then the world has turned at last." The messenger bowed and left them, his horse's hooves fading into the distance. The night grew still again. Fireflies flickered among the vines. Antonio looked at her, his voice low. "Lucia, we've fought so long for truth. What will you fight for now?" She met his gaze. "For life, for what comes after struggle." He smiled. "And what if life asks for love?" She didn't look away. "Then I will give it freely without fear." Antonio took her hands. "Lucia Bellini, I've loved you since the first day I saw you standing in the rain, defying the world with nothing but courage in your eyes. I have waited for the storm to end so I could ask you this. Will you marry me?" Her breath caught. The night seemed to hold its breath too. She looked down, her tears falling onto their joined hands. "All my life I've belonged to silence," she whispered, "to duty, to secrecy, to promises I didn't make but had to keep. If I say yes now, it will be the first promise that is truly mine." Antonio smiled, his voice unsteady with joy. "Then make it yours." She nodded once, firmly. "Yes, I will." He drew her close, and for a moment the years of fear vanished as if they had never been. His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. Their lips met, soft and certain, sealing what had long been written in their hearts. When they parted, Lucia laughed through her tears. "I never thought peace could feel like this." Antonio brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Peace always feels like you." Behind them, Marco clapped his hands, grinning from ear to ear. "You're getting married?" Lucia turned, startled. "You heard?" He nodded eagerly. "I heard enough. Can I be there? Can I bring my friends from school?" Antonio laughed. "You'll stand beside us, Marco. The day belongs to you too." The boy's eyes shone. "Then it will be the best day ever." In the weeks that followed, the village prepared for the wedding as if it were a festival. The church bells rang each morning as Lucia walked through the square, greeted by smiles instead of whispers. Women sewed her gown, simple but elegant, and children picked flowers from the hills. Father Tommaso insisted on performing the ceremony himself. "It is not every day," he said proudly, "that love redeems both the humble and the noble at once." Antonio worked tirelessly, arranging benches, painting the chapel doors, trimming vines from the courtyard. The people helped him, laughing and singing as they worked. Lucia spent her days in quiet joy, her heart at peace for the first time. Yet the night before the wedding she couldn't sleep. She sat outside under the stars, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Antonio found her there, carrying a lantern. "You should rest," he said softly. "I was remembering," she replied. "The night he came, the Marquis, the storm, the fear, how it all began. If he could see us now, he would be proud," Antonio said. "He'd see that love doesn't die with a man's mistakes." Lucia looked at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "And what do you see, Antonio?" He smiled. I see a woman who carried the world's judgment and never let it break her. I see my home." She reached for his hand. "Then stay beside me. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after." "I will," he said simply. The dawn came bright and clear, the sky painted gold. Bells rang across the valley. The villagers gathered, their voices a joyful hum. Lucia stepped out of her cottage, dressed in white linen trimmed with lace. A wreath of olive leaves crowned her dark hair. Marco walked beside her, proud and tall, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. When they reached the chapel, Antonio waited by the door. He wore no finery, only a clean coat and a white shirt. But the way he looked at her made the world fall away. The priest raised his hands and the murmurs fell silent. "My children," Father Tommaso began, "you have walked through shadow to reach this day. May light now follow you wherever you go." As he spoke the vows, Lucia's voice trembled only once when she said his name. Antonio's words were firm, full of the calm strength she had always admired. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the bells pealed wildly, echoing across the valley. The crowd cheered. Marco threw petals into the air, laughing. Music rose, the simple tune of fiddles and tambourines, filling the square with life. Lucia and Antonio led the procession back to the vineyard, where tables waited under the vines. The villagers feasted and danced until the sun began to sink behind the hills. As the evening light turned golden, Antonio took Lucia's hand. "Come," he said, "I have something to show you." He led her to the edge of the vineyard, where the olive tree stood, the same tree under which she had buried the Marquis's letter. The grass around it was green and full of tiny white flowers. Antonio knelt and uncovered a small wooden box buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the Marquis's medallion, gleaming faintly in the last light of day. Lucia touched it, her fingers trembling. "You kept it?" "I kept it for this moment," he said. "So you could see what once was shame now shining as a blessing." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "You always find the right words." He stood and placed the medallion around her neck. "Because you've given me the right heart." The music drifted up from the square, soft and distant. Lucia rested her head against his chest. "Do you think he's watching?" she whispered. Antonio looked up at the fading sky. "If love leaves anything behind, he is." They stood there until the first stars appeared. Then they walked back to the celebration hand in hand. The night became a blur of laughter and dancing. The villagers toasted their names, the children played, and the music never stopped. Marco danced between them, his face glowing with pride. When the candles burned low and the guests began to leave, Antonio took Lucia's hand once more. "Let's walk," he said quietly. They slipped away from the crowd, down the vineyard path glowing faintly in the starlight. The air was warm and full of the scent of ripe grapes. Lucia turned to him, her smile soft. "I used to dream of nights like this, quiet, safe, filled with nothing but the sound of the wind." Antonio drew her close. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I don't need to dream anymore." He kissed her then, not with haste or fear, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had waited his whole life to find home. She wrapped her arms around him, her heart full, her spirit free. When they parted, she whispered, "You've given me more than love, Antonio. You've given me my name back." He smiled against her hair. "Then promise me one thing." "What?" "That you'll never let the world make you small again." Lucia looked up at him. "I promise." The wind carried the distant sound of the bells, softer now, almost like laughter. Above them, the stars seemed to shimmer brighter, as if the heavens themselves were blessing the life that had begun from so much pain. They walked back to the cottage where Marco was already asleep by the hearth. The firelight flickered over his face, peaceful and innocent. Lucia stood for a long moment watching him. "He's safe," she said quietly. "Truly safe." Antonio came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "He has his mother's courage. The world will not break him." She leaned back against him. "And his father's grace." He smiled. "Perhaps a little of both." The flames danced lower, the house warm and still. Lucia turned in his arms, her voice no more than a whisper. "Do you remember what you asked me once? What I would do if life asked for love?" "I remember," he said. She smiled. "Then here is my answer." Her lips met his again, and the years of sorrow, fear, and loneliness melted into something infinite and tender. When the morning came, the hills were golden with light. The vineyard shimmered with dew. Lucia stepped outside, barefoot in the grass, breathing in the sweetness of a world reborn. Antonio followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Marco's laughter echoed from the garden, where he was chasing butterflies with the dog. Lucia turned to Antonio, her eyes bright. "We've come so far." "Yes," he said softly. "And we have farther still to go." She smiled. "Together, always." They stood there in the sunlight, the vineyard stretching before them, the sound of bells and birds mingling in the warm air. The world, once cruel and closed, had opened its arms at last. Antonio took her hand, lifting it to his lips. "From the day the Marquis placed that child in your arms," he said, "the world began again. Today it belongs to us." Lucia's heart swelled. "Then let us live it fully." And as the wind swept gently across the hills, carrying the scent of harvest and hope, Lucia knew that love, quiet, patient, and steadfast, had finally conquered every sorrow. The bells of Montieri rang once more, not for loss or confession, but for joy. And in their music, the story of the Marquis, the village woman, and the child who united two worlds found its final, everlasting peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.